Tonight you'll be watching a video on classifying quadrilaterals. We're going to be looking at parallelograms, rectangles, squares, rhombus, trapezoid, and kite. Parallelogram. Notice that the opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent. Notice that the opposite sides of a parallelogram are also parallel. Notice that the opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. Rhombus. In a rhombus, all four sides are congruent. Opposite sides of a rhombus are parallel. In a rhombus, opposite angles are also congruent. Due to the fact that a rhombus has opposite sides congruent, opposite sides parallel, and opposite angles congruent, a rhombus can also be called a parallelogram. Rectangle. Notice that the opposite sides of a rectangle are congruent. Also notice that the opposite sides of a rectangle are parallel. In the case of a rectangle, all four angles measure 90 degrees. Therefore, all angles are congruent, as well as opposite angles being congruent. The fact that a rectangle has opposite sides congruent, opposite sides parallel, and opposite angles congruent allows it to also be classified as a parallelogram. Square. Notice on a square, all sides are congruent. If all sides are congruent, therefore opposite sides are congruent. Also notice that opposite sides are parallel. Notice on a square that all four angles measure 90 degrees. If all four angles are congruent, then opposite angles are also congruent. Because a square has opposite sides congruent, opposite sides parallel, and opposite angles congruent, it is also called a parallelogram. Due to the fact that opposite sides are congruent, opposite sides are parallel, and all four angles measure 90 degrees, a square can also be called a rectangle. Because a square also meets the criteria of having all sides congruent, opposite sides parallel, and opposite angles congruent, it may also be called a rhombus. The last two quadrilateral types we will look at are a trapezoid and a kite. A trapezoid has only one set of parallel lines. A kite has adjacent sides congruent as well as opposite angles congruent.